Are we ready? Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Today we'll be talking about connecting any external data source with a custom Apex connector. I'm Joyce. I'm an engineer on the Salesforce Connect team, and we have Jintong in the back, who's not on stage with me, but she'll be available to answer questions. I can't point her out because I don't see her. Hi. So let's start first with forward-looking statements, a friendly reminder to not base any purchasing decisions based on any forward-looking statements you see here today. So most of my demo will be on things that are GA already, but there is a roadmap slide which has some spoilers, so safe harbor. All right, the agenda for today, I will introduce Salesforce Connect and give a brief overview. We'll talk about the 3 different kinds of connectors, and then we'll have a demo on how to write your own Apex connector. Then we have a little bonus session, so we'll switch contexts a little bit and start talking about OData connectors and how to debug them, because that is a pain point for many of our customers. And then we'll end with a roadmap. So before I introduce Salesforce Connect, let's talk a little bit about what problem it solves. Data lives everywhere. It can be in other cloud systems. It can be on-premise. So how do we integrate them all together? And how do we prevent data silos or stale data? And this is a good introduction for Salesforce Connect. Salesforce Connect allows you to connect to any external system in hours, not days. And the data never leaves the external system. So we virtually access the data in real time, so you never have the worry about out-of-date data or out-of-sync data. You don't need to worry about copying it over. And you're able to create business processes that reach beyond data. You can create relationships between your custom and standard objects and your external objects, which we'll get into soon. Okay, so there are 3 different kinds of connectors. Let's start with cross-org. So cross-org connectors allow you to connect 2 Salesforce orgs together. Second, we have OData. So OData data sources support OData compliant data sources, and both of these, cross-org and OData, do not require code. So you can access this through setup in a declarative way. And finally, we have custom connector, which is the topic of our demo today. You can build your own connector in Apex, and all callouts are made over an HTTP request, which we will get into later. And the really cool thing about custom connectors that is not heavily publicized is that you can join multiple tables into one external object. So what is an external object? External objects are what we like to call the cousin of custom objects. They look very similar, and they feel and look the same in the platform. You have fields on them, and external objects represent a schema, just like custom objects do, but they're the metadata for your external data. You're able to connect to a variety of different data sources and access or virtualize many different kinds of data. The key difference between custom and external objects is that custom objects are stored in Salesforce, and external objects are only referenced and are stored in your external system. So with that, let's start preparing for our demo. Today we'll be integrating Salesforce with a real estate application over REST. So I do have a REST service that I created, and what I have are 2 tables, realtor and property. And what I want to be able to do is bring that or access that in my Salesforce org. So I've created a rough data model of how I want my Salesforce org to look. So we have contact, which is in the Salesforce blue. It's the standard object in your org. And then I have a one-to-one mapping to realtor __ X. The X represents external objects in the same way that custom objects end with C. And a realtor has a one-to-many relationship with properties. Now, how do I even begin setting up a custom connector? In my case, because I have a REST service, I'm not able to use an out-of-the-box OData or cross-org connector. Instead, I'll have to write my own in Apex, which requires that I create two classes, the connection class and the provider class. The connection class is where you define the schema and how you handle querying, pagination, and search. And then you have the provider class, which is where you define details about authentication and what capabilities your data source should have, such as whether or not you can query or write to it or read to it, etc. Okay, so let's get into the demo. I'd like to introduce you to the REST service first and see how that looks. I have a REST client here, and I have a service that I wrote in Heroku. So if I do /property, that endpoint returns JSON of the different properties I have. It's pretty standard. You do see that every property has a status, whether it's for sale or the sale is pending, it's in escrow. We have details about the property, like the address, how many bedrooms. And what's interesting here is the realtor ID. This is how we link a property to a realtor. And we'll get into more of how we can do that in Salesforce. This leads me to my realtor entity. This endpoint returns the first name and the last name of a realtor and their license number. And we'll get into why license number is important and how we'll connect that to a contact in Salesforce. So let's get started. I have already implemented the classes, but we'll walk through them together. There's no particular reason I'm using Eclipse as my IDE. I just thought the colors look nice, so here we are. I'm going to start first with my provider class, but in general, you should start with your connection class first, and you'll see why. But for the demo, it's a little bit easier for me to start with the provider class. So the first method that you need to override is get authentication capabilities. So this returns a list of authentication capabilities, such as anonymous, basic, OAuth, certificate. Authentication is probably a session on its own, so we won't get too much into it. My service, as you saw, required no authentication, so I'll go ahead and add that to my result. And I'll add in basic for fun, so we can see what that does and set up. Next, we need to implement get capabilities. So in my case, I just want to query, and I want to be able to search through my data. But other capabilities could be writing. You could write to your external data source. You could delete from it. You can update. And from here, we have enough to define our external data source. So what does that mean? If we come into setup, so this page, I already have the Apex classes in my org. So we'll come here, and in setup, this is external data sources. Let's create a new one, and we can give it the name property service. Here we have our custom connector, which is or appears in this type dropdown because my Apex class is already saved in my org. So I can go ahead and click this one. Anonymous is populated by default because that's what I specified in my class. But as you can see, per user and named principal are also here because basic was added as another authentication capability. There's more on different authentication possibilities in the documentation. So let's go ahead and save that. So we have the specifics of our connection here. What's next? Now we need to create our custom or our external objects to define the schema of how our data will look. So let's go back to our provider class. The provider class references a connection class, which is why you need to create the connection first. And the connection class allows us to define our schema and how to sync our external objects. So let's start here with the base URL of my service. And we have two endpoints, property and realtor. So that shows how we can access the API. So what I care about now is syncing the metadata over. So we have a method called sync, which returns a list of tables. So you can think of tables as the external object. And on a table, there are columns, and that represents the field on the external object. And then later, we'll get into the rows of that table, which is the data or the records in Salesforce. So we'll start here by initializing a list of tables. Let's start with the realtor entity. So let's define as columns first. We always start with external ID and display URL. Those are standard fields on every external object. So just, it's required here, bear with me, we'll get into what to fill it in with later. Then we have first name, last name. These are both text fields, pretty straightforward. And what's interesting here is the indirect lookup. An indirect lookup is a field of type lookup, which goes from external object to a standard or custom field. And from here, you see I've defined the name that I want my field to be, and then what field it looks up to. So the field is on contact, and it's a custom field called realtor license number. So if we come into my org, I've already created this field earlier. I've made this field an external ID, and it's unique and it's required. So this, the unique part helps me keep my one-to-one relationship, and also I want it to be a one-to-one relationship, so I've set it to required. And then we want to create the table now. So the table represents the external object. This one is for realtor, so I name it realtor, and then we have singular, plural description, very common metadata for custom objects as well, and I'll add it to my results set right here. Continuing on, I want to do the same for properties. So as you can see in this class, you can define multiple objects. You don't need to create a new class for every object you're creating. And it's more of the same. We have very common text and number fields. The only interesting to call out here is the external object, which is the external lookup, which is a lookup between two external objects. And this is used for the one-to-many relationship between realtor and property. And what this does is you define the name of the field. So my field is going to be called realtor ID on the object property, and it looks up to the realtor object, which is underscore underscore x. So now that I've created my tables, it returns it. If I go back into my org, when I call validate and sync, that's the method that it's calling. And I want to sync both the property and realtor table, and we should be creating the external objects now. And we're going to be using them soon, so I'll go ahead and create a couple tabs so we can use them in a bit. This is, again, very similar to custom object. If you've noticed, the flow is something that you should be familiar with. If you are familiar with the platform, the ramp-up time should be very minimal when you're dealing with external objects. OK, now let's go back. The next thing we want to do now is talk about the data. How do you see the data, and how do we query for it? So we have a handy query method, and what we do is we pass in a context, and from the context we can see which object we're trying to query for. So I've gone ahead and written a method called getRows, where we pass in what table we want. And from there, we're in getRows now, we either decide realtor property endpoint. So we generate the URL, and then we make a get callout. The get callout is just an HTTP request, and you're able to send the endpoint and the method. So you go ahead, send the request, and we have the response back. My response is a JSON object, so I'm able to deserialize it as I would in Apex in a very simple manner. And I iterate through the results set and populate the rows in the table. So rows up here was initialized to be a map with the field as the key, and then the value as the object. Okay. So let's go back to my org. Now I can go to the property object. I'll come here, and let's view everything. When we click all, it's calling that query method. We haven't stored this data in Salesforce. I'm going to add more fields to make this a little bit more interesting. You'll see here in the display URL, I've created my own display URL, which is in my service. I'm able to do / in the external ID, and it takes you right to the record. I don't think I added that correctly, so let's try again. Great. And by default, filtering works. So I only want to see properties where the city is San Francisco, because that's where we are today. OK, let's go ahead and save. And I have one property. You'll notice here, let me go into the record so we can see the full field names. The realtor ID was an indirect lookup field. So if I go ahead and click that, this is the ID, the external ID of the realtor record, which again is an external object. And then I had created an indirect lookup to contact, which I'd populated before. So that license number that we had seen here, AAAA, resolves itself to Astro Trailblazer. And this way, you're able to create more complex schema and intermix your custom and standard objects with your external objects. And you can query for these in SQL. You can report on them, and you can create list views as well. OK, let's get back to the slides. OK. So there's a little bit of a context switch because we have a bonus demo today. Now we can think about OData connectors where we don't have access to the HTTP request and response. So how would you debug that? Okay. So in Spring 18, we added the request and response details to the Apex debug log. So up at the top, if you click User and then Debug Log, and you set the callout log level to finest, you'll be able to see that every time you load a list view or reporting or anytime a callout is made, the callout request and response is seen. So we give you the endpoint to see exactly what request we made, and then you can see the response back. So the body of the response and also more details. So I have my debug log loaded from earlier. It's quite small. But if I look at the request, let me see if I can paste this. You're able to see that we're actually making a request out to this endpoint, which has all of the filter criteria appended to the end. We're doing a GET call, and we have not set any header authorizations. So this is the first step in debugging. You want to make sure the request looks as you expect. If it does, then you can look through the response. Is this the expected response that you expect to receive from your external system? From here, this is the actual body of the response. So a lot of times I've seen users who create OData data sources aren't able to really fully understand what's going wrong when they don't get the expected results in the report or their list view. And this is very helpful if you do create an OData data source. OK. All right, so takeaways from this session. I hope that you now feel comfortable writing your own Apex connector. So with Salesforce Connect overall, you can connect to external data and reference it in real time. Data is never stored in Salesforce, so you don't need to worry about stale data or copying over. If you don't have an OData provider, that's OK. It's easy to build one. I think when we went through the Apex code today, it was very straightforward. There are also many more examples online if you'd like to give it a try yourself. And debugging OData and crossword connectors is much easier than before now that we've added more debug logs for you. I see you have a question. Let me get through all the slides, and a few of us will be up here afterward. OK, so we do have a Connect roadmap slide. I'm not going to get too much in depth about it. It was talked about in our previous session earlier this morning on external objects. So you can watch the recording for that or talk to Jintong later. She'll be here. There she is. She's our product manager. And then, yep, so here we are. You can learn more about integration at TrailDX. We have our booth there. It says Connect, and then platform events right behind it if you have any questions. We also have our Integration Cloud booth right at the front. And you can earn badges and learn more about integration on Trailhead. It's probably the end of TrailDX, so I think all of these sessions have passed. But I highly recommend this one that happened at 10:30 this morning, if you can find the recording. It's on external objects, how to write triggers and batch Apex with them. And Jintong is in that presentation, and she talks a lot about the roadmap. Okay. Other resources, we'd love if you join us on the Trailblazer community. Feel free to post your questions or use cases that you have. We try to be responsive on that. If you want to get started with an Apex connector, our documentation has a lot of examples that you can try out first before you connect to your own external system. And that's it. Thank you, everyone, for your time. I'll stick around for questions, and a few other engineers are here as well.